Namaskar, hello and welcome viewers. You're watching Perspective with your host Kriti Mishra. At the invitation of Chinese President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is attending the 14th BRICS Summit hosted by China in virtual format. This includes a high-level dialogue on global development. BRICS is a multilateral forum consisting of 5 major emerging economies of the world, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. It has become a platform for discussing and deliberating on issues of common concern for all developing countries. Discussions during the 14th BRICS Summit are expected to cover intra-BRICS cooperation in areas such as counter-terrorism, trade, health, traditional medicine, environment, IT and innovation, agriculture, technical and vocational training, and MSMEs. Discussions are also likely on issues like reform of the multilateral system, combating COVID-19 pandemic, and global economic recovery, among others. And for deeper insights on this 14th BRICS Summit, I'm joined by an illustrious panel of guests. So in the studio, we have with us Mr. Suresh K. Goyal, former ambassador. Welcome to Sansad TV, sir. And joining us through virtual platform, Dr. Sriram Cholia, foreign affairs expert, and Mr. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign affairs editor, Hindustan. I welcome both of you on Sansad Television and thank you so much for joining us. And Ambassador Goyal, let me begin the program with you. We know that China is challenging the territorial status quo along its periphery. There are tectonic global shifts given the war between Russia and Ukraine. In this context, your opening thoughts on the importance of 14th BRICS Summit?
You see, when BRICS actually started with BRIC as the initial driving force in 2001, the idea, to the best of my mind, really for starting the BRICS was not really so much of the strategic and the security framework, but mostly focusing on the economic cooperation. Please do recall that at that time the world was passing through economic tectonic shifts. There was recession on the horizon, the currency was going down, the stock market was going down, and therefore with China and India, which had come to be known as Chindia, were considered to be the driving force for a new economic paradigm which could actually save the world. Today, the situation has gone diametrically in the other direction. Today, the challenges facing the world are, of course, economic. Yes. They remain, but they have also gone in a direction of entirely security and the strategic issues. You mentioned China. You didn't mention Russia so much. Ukraine is taking place at the moment. China and Russia, they have become the fastest friends in the world, yes, beyond limits, etc., etc. And therefore, there is that kind of a platform where China and Russia are coming together. So there is a big possibility, or shall I say the risk, that China and Russia could also use BRICS for purposes other than economic cooperation. Right. And I think that's a factor which we need to guard against. That is number one. Number two, I think given the fact that the world is still emerging from pandemic and that there are challenges in front of the world, economic slowdown, which we are now facing, the currencies, financial flows, it would be useful if the BRICS was to focus on economic re-emergence in the world. Please do recall that they are also part of the G20. Absolutely. And many of these countries are also part of G7. India is in the G7 also, but some countries may have been invited to G7 taking place after this. Therefore, I think it will be useful for the platform to focus more on economic issues rather than the other challenging issues to which I don't see any immediate solutions. So best to focus on economy. All right, so best to focus on economy.
Let me take that to Dr. Cholia. Dr. Cholia, as ambassador, is saying that it is best to focus on economy right now. So given the context, the current context, what do you think BRICS Summit would bring to the table for India?
I think for India, Kriti, the main thing, like Prime Minister Modi has already outlined in his initial remarks, is that we are looking for post-COVID recovery. We are looking to prevent relapse into another global deep recession. And the signs have not been good since the war began in Ukraine. Now the inflationary pressures, supply chain bottlenecks, fuel and food shortages are causing tremendous pressure So I think the BRICS countries, through their own internal mechanisms as well as advocacy for developing countries, can help alleviate what the situation, the global economic situation. So definitely our focus on that. Prime Minister also raised the issue of what he called practical steps and measures which need to continue. So these are not earth-shaking ones, but they can cumulatively add up to support the economic recovery. He spoke about the vaccine R&D center and the efforts to improve healthcare in the region. He spoke about the mutual recognition of pharmaceuticals among BRICS countries. And there's a variety of other mechanisms and working groups that we have created over the last 15 years on agriculture and education, youth, women, labor groups. There are all kinds of infrastructure for BRICS institutionalization that have happened. So that work, I think, should continue. There's not going to be very spectacular achievement or takeaway from the BRICS summit, simply because, for the reasons you outlined, Kriti, which is, the Chinese and the Russians are trying to use BRICS as a platform to just go on an attack against the US. And I don't think it's in our interest to tag along on this agenda. And we are therefore trying to get the BRICS to focus on the basics and on the core purpose for which it existed. We want a reform of the multilateral system and order. But I think the whole agenda of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, for example, is saying that there is a Western push for hegemony and that is causing great threat to world peace and all that. I mean, frankly, right now, it's hard to see how we can agree with all these viewpoints. We have a different threat perception. China, which is sitting with us alongside us in BRICS, is our number one adversary. So we are not going to go along with this kind of effort to politicize the BRICS. Security cooperation, you mentioned, that is good. National security advisors are talking about counter-terrorism, which is a safe subject. I mean, this is something on which all BRICS countries can agree. We are all opposed to jihadist extremism and fundamentalism. And barring Brazil, which doesn't really get affected by it, South Africa also now has a problem in Mozambique next door, where there has been an uprising of Islamists. And of course, India, China, Russia, all three of us face this menace. So those kind of things, practical measures are good. But to expect this grouping, once upon a time, we were hoping that BRICS will be the basis for building a new world order and for all emerging economies to come together and on equitable basis to bring about huge transformation. That is not happening, primarily because of the China factor and to a lesser extent Russia's extreme measures that they have taken in Europe now. So I think we have to be cautious. We are also not in favor of sanctions. To that extent, maybe all BRICS countries can agree that we are not in favor of sanctions as a solution. We are in favor of negotiated settlements to the ongoing war in Europe and such things. But if you add up all of it, I think it's a work in progress, and we'll persist with this institution because each country gets something out of it. Some of our interests are still being served in it. But to expect this to be a vehicle for a new world order, I think that's far-fetched. And China has gone astray completely. And he's got a unilateral agenda and is not really a team player anymore. They are just using this summit, in my view, for grandstanding and to project themselves as still benign. But that's not accepted by us or many other member countries of BRICS themselves. So I think overall, we have to lower expectations and just let this institution carry on without believing it will be a big transformative vehicle or engine anymore.
All right, Mr. Chaudhary. Dr. Sriram Cholia says that different sides, different agendas, difficult geopolitical situations, looking at spectacular gains or outcomes, that should be a far-fetched goal right now. Do you agree with him?
BRICS has never actually had any spectacular accomplishments. So yes, this will be a particularly difficult environment for the BRICS summit to accomplish very much. One, it's a virtual summit, and most virtual summits don't get very far because a large part of the summit is the ability of world leaders to speak and meet privately with each other. Second, as he's correctly said, the problem there is China. China is one, overwhelmingly powerful within the BRICS. The BRICS, we like to say, is whatever 40% of the world GDP, but the fact is that within the BRICS, 70% of GDP represented by the BRICS countries is one country, which is China. There is minimal trade between the BRICS countries, except all of them trade with China. So that overwhelming Chinese position within the BRICS has been something that has always been a matter of concern. At a time when India and China are still daggers drawn on the border and on various other issues, the Brazilian President Bolsonaro is not a particularly great fan of China either. He's also been very skeptical as to whether Brazil should even stay in the BRICS. He doesn't see why. His foreign policy advisor once publicly said, "It's not clear to me why we're still a member of this organization." And then on top of that, the incredible geopolitical and economic dependence that Russia has now developed on China following the Ukraine war means that this BRICS is internally even more skewed in Beijing's favor.
Right.
Which means as a balance of power, if you look upon it as a balance of power organization, it can't really play that role because it has a balance of power problem inside the BRICS, in where Brazil and India are very clearly concerned about an overweening Chinese position. Economically, again, it's a lot of, if it moves anywhere in the economic sphere, it will automatically benefit China more than it will anybody else. So it has to therefore focus, or will attempt to focus, on areas that have been mentioned, like counter-terrorism, maybe some trade issues, some sanctions issues, some international principles, shall we say, that emerging economies generally have in common. But these are a relatively thin gruel, and they're not going to come up, they're not going to make a major splash. The biggest accomplishment of the BRICS Summit, I think, this year is that it's actually being held at all, given that
Yes.
China is in a COVID crisis. Vladimir Putin has not left his country now since the war began. I think Prime Minister Modi would find it difficult to go to a summit hosted by Xi Jinping as long as certain issues on the border remain unresolved. And Bolsonaro is going into a very difficult election in October and indicated he's not really interested in going anywhere in the world, definitely not a BRICS summit. So you
Yes.
basically have a BRICS in which none of the members are particularly invested in accomplishing very much right now. But the geopolitical trends that we're seeing, particularly between Russia and China, make the BRICS, in my view, even more difficult. It'll make the BRICS even more difficult to function as an organization in the future.
All right. So as you said that there's balance of power within BRICS right now, Ambassador. That's what Mr. Chaudhary is saying. In that case, how difficult it is going to be to ensure that post the summit, the joint statement is neutral and the platform is not used for propaganda against US and its allies.
You see, when we look at BRICS, when it started as BRIC and then BRICS, it started with grand ambitions of really bringing some order into the global geoeconomics. Slowly, over the last 1 decade, slightly more than 1 decade, the disparities between the different countries, both at economic level and the strategic level, have made sure that every country is practically going in their own direction. And therefore, if we want to see that the BRICS actually can do something, even a minimal thing really is to not to go into the grand kind of schemes. We can have 20 different kind of working groups on different things and do nothing at all, which is actually precisely what is happening at the moment. Or choose 2 or 3 which are more important at the moment to the countries, not just BRICS, but the world, and do those things. And also, very importantly, to ensure that the organization does not become hostage to narrow national interests
Absolutely.
of any one particular member. You talk about the balance of power. Balance of power has always existed in different country organizations. You take United Nations, earlier NAM, etc. There are always countries which are more influential than the others, and that would be the fact of life. But in this particular case, therefore, choose 2 or 3 important ones. And I would say that in those cases, climate, food security, financial flows, the issues of geo-economy would be, I think, the issues which can bring the countries together. Adopt a minimal agenda, a minimal kind of an outcome statement, 3 or 4 different issues, talk about bread and butter, and leave the rest for future.
All right. But The other aspect, of course, Dr. Cholia, that we're talking about is that we're looking at expansion of the BRICS grouping. Now, what are the conditions that New Delhi should enunciate upon for such an expansion? What are the pros and cons for India?
Chinese are the biggest advocates for BRICS Plus. They want more members. And in a way, it has happened with the New Development Bank, which is a kind of a sub-institution of BRICS, their own creation. Bangladesh, Egypt, Uruguay, UAE, these four have been admitted as members along with the 5 BRICS countries. So it's actually 9 now in the New Development Bank. And in fact, that's one of the success stories of BRICS. If you look back, they have managed to give out loans, and for infrastructure and development projects, a number of countries worth over $25 billion. So to that extent, and it's a jointly financed, it's not a Chinese, dominated institution. We have made sure that the design of the New Development Bank is fairer and more democratic. So I think those sort of things do suggest that the other developing countries still hope that these so-called leading emerging economies, which are more advanced, will support the least developed, or the LDCs. So I think there may be room. In fact, the Chinese have invited very large number of heads of government to a high-level dialogue after the main summit is over on June 24th. So what they're trying to show is that we are now forming this big grouping of all the developing countries to oppose Western neo-colonialism and hegemony and that kind of thing. But I think it's more, people are smarter now, and expansion ought to be on the basis of regional principle, first of all. We would like, because BRICS is intercontinental. So from every continent, there should be some representation to make it, look like it's not just the leading powers of Asia and of Africa and Latin America or Eurasia, but also middle and small powers from this region. So if they are involved, it's not a bad idea, but only thing we need to look for is cohesion. Already we are speaking about a lot of differences among 5 members. If it becomes 15 or 20, and then, getting consensus and agreements and communiques is going to be hard, not to mention actual real projects and initiatives. Something like New Development Bank could not have been conceived if there were 15 or 20 altogether. Right. We needed a small group of 5. So this plurilateral model is good. And I think we should be very selective in admitting. I think the Chinese are also looking to bring in members who are going to tilt ideologically in their favor against the West. Even the Russians will not mind it, given their current, there are daggers drawn with the West. So I think there, we should look for balance also. I would say balance of foreign policies, mix of countries which are, on all ends of the spectrum. They could be pro-Indian, they could be pro-Chinese, they could be pro-Western, pro-Russian, whatever, but we need a mix of all of them. That way we can ensure that, the Chinese don't team up here also and make life difficult for other countries and corner them, because then it becomes a unilateral vehicle. And if the day that happens, then BRICS is of absolutely no use to us. We have conceived and designed it in such a way it's not a unilateral thing. So I think these are the principles we should look for.
Those are very strong statements that you're making, Dr. Cholia. Those are very, very strong statements that you're making. Let me take that to Mr. Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary, as he said, that when BRICS, the grouping was founded, the basic aspect, of course, was that this grouping would be an engine of global growth, economic growth. Given the security challenges, the economic aspirations, the alignments, the realignments, how do you assess the future of BRICS?
So BRICS, the country that is now, BRICS was originally the brainchild of, in fact, Vladimir Putin. It was he who put it together, called for the summit in 2009 on the basis of the Goldman Sachs report. They were the Russians were the first first government to effectively come up with the idea. India was actually skeptical about a body. I remember being to 3 or 4 BRICS summits, and I remember flying once to one of them with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who, as you know, is a trained economist, and asking him, does the BRICS make any sense to you? And he said, you can't have an economic formation that's based on a report by an investment bank. That doesn't make any sense. The G20 is where we will focus our energies on, but BRICS is there, so we will continue to see what we can do with it. BRICS's utility for India is partly about maintaining at least the image of India being an autonomous power in the global system. So we are a member of the Quad, we are a member of BRICS, we are a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we are a member of BRIMSTEC. It's useful to be a member of as many international organizations that have the potential to do something later on. The third element of utility, which I think has been a bit of a surprise for us, is that China takes this now much more seriously than any of the other BRICS members. Definitely Russia is now a relatively weak BRICS member in terms of its activity, as well as its economic clout. So China has now become the driver, if you wish, in the front seat of the BRICS. And because the BRICS Summit requires that all the members show up, all the heads of state and government must show up for a quorum to be had, we have been able to leverage this on occasion to extract concessions from China.
Right.
For example, one of the reasons China eventually walked back in the Doklam border crisis was that Xi Jinping was hosting the BRICS Summit that August in Xiamen, and the Indian side effectively said that if you want Prime Minister Modi to attend, you have to resolve this problem on the border. And the point was, of course, that if Modi didn't attend, the summit would have to be canceled because then a quorum was not going to be achieved. And Xi Jinping would have been humiliated at home because he had played up that summit in Chinese media and in the public. So it's useful for us in that way. But the geopolitics, as I've said right now, go against the BRICS accomplishing very much. And to some degree, I think we will see India and Brazil, as I've mentioned, drag their heels on bringing in new members. Some of the media reports already say India is saying that we must have criteria.
Right.
Criteria among 5 countries that are so disparate in many ways will be very difficult and will drag the process in for several years. Brazil is not very enthusiastic either, especially given its sort of frenemy relationship with Argentina, one of the key candidates. So we'll see how this plays out. South Africa is not enthusiastic about having another African country join either. So you'll see how this plays out, but I think we'll see a sort of a degree of paralysis, if you wish, with the BRICS over the next few years. As India invests more in the Quad, Russia becomes more increasingly dependent on China, to the point that I think the Russia's autonomy in the international system will be under question for quite some time. And then we'll have to see where Brazil goes. I think Brazil will probably lurch back and leftward in the next election. But effectively, one party, the right wing of Brazil, is already saying BRICS doesn't make much sense. We don't see the purpose of this organization. So it means Brazil will be a fluctuating member, if you wish, in the BRICS. In those circumstances, it's hard to see the BRICS getting very far for at least 3-4 years, unless I think there's a major shift in where the global system, particularly the economic system, you'll see the rise of inflation, the return of inflation, the return of a first major global recession in 2008, 2009, the rise of a whole set of new global technology coalitions. Quad is built around a lot of those itself, could potentially result in the BRICS countries starting to work together in some of those areas, for example, digital standards.
Absolutely. I'm completely out of time here, Mr. Chaudhary, completely out of time here. But in the studio, I could just see the ambassador smiling and nodding vociferously. Ambassador, I'll give you the last word.
Very briefly, I think there is one point which I want to make is that what China is trying to do is develop plurilateral or multilateral institutions which are China-centric as a kind of a response to the existing multilateral institutions like G7, G20, where there is a lot of presence of the developed countries or the Western countries. Therefore, any attempt at expanding BRICS, for example, I would look at it as a kind of a Chinese G7 or G20 minus developed countries. And I think we have to basically guard against that.
All right, so we have to guard against that, and we'll also have to see how that pans out. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chaudhary, Dr. Sriram Chalia, and Ambassador Goyal. Well, viewers, that's all we had for you in this edition of Perspective. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Namaskar.